The Montana Territory of 1867 was no place for a man running from his past, but William Cross had nowhere else to go. When he arrived at his dead brother's ranch expecting to sell and disappear, he found Evangeline, a black woman claiming to be his brother's widow, legally entitled to everything he needed to survive. Cross married her out of duty to honor his brother's dying wish, but their arrangement of convenience became something deeper when a mute, traumatized boy from the local freedmen's school drew a picture that stopped Cross's heart cold. The child had sketched the rocking horse Cross had carved for the son he lost during the war, the boy he'd spent 2 years searching for across a broken nation. Now Cross faced an impossible choice between reclaiming his past and protecting the fragile family that had saved them all. The dust never settled in Montana Territory. It hung in the air like ghosts, coating everything with the grit of broken promises and forgotten dreams. William Cross rode through it now, his horse's hooves marking time against the hard-packed earth that led to his brother's ranch. He'd come to bury the past, sell the land, disappear into the vastness that swallowed men whole and asked no questions. The ranch house sat squat against the horizon, weathered wood and tin roof catching the late afternoon sun. Smoke curled from the chimney. Cross pulled his horse to a stop, studying the scene. Someone was home. He'd expected emptiness, dust-covered furniture and the hollow echo of a life cut short. Instead, the porch was swept clean. Curtains hung straight in the windows. The barn doors stood open, revealing the shadow of livestock within. Cross dismounted, boots hitting the ground with the finality of a coffin lid. He approached the front door, spurs chiming a funeral dirge against his heels. The door opened before he could knock. She stood in the doorway like a queen, in exile, tall, graceful, with eyes that held secrets and shoulders that carried burdens without complaint. Her dress was simple but well made, her hair pulled back in a style that spoke of education and refinement. "You must be William." Her voice carried no surprise, no fear, only a quiet certainty that made Cross feel like the intruder he was. "Thomas is dead." The words came out harder than he'd intended. She didn't flinch. "I know. I buried him." Cross studied her face, searching for the grief that should have been there. He found something else instead. Relief, maybe. Or resignation. "I'm his widow." The words hit Cross like a physical blow. He'd known Thomas was alone out here. Lonely. Desperate, maybe. But this woman, this poised creature who stood before him like she owned the very air she breathed, was not what he'd expected to find claiming his brother's name. She stepped aside, a gesture both invitation and challenge. "Come in." The house was clean. Too clean. The kind of clean that spoke of careful hands and meticulous attention. Nothing was out of place. Every surface gleamed, with the dull sheen of regular polish. Cross had expected decay. Instead, he found a home. She moved to the kitchen without ceremony, her steps sure and practiced. This was her domain. She knew where everything belonged because she'd put it there. "Coffee?" Cross nodded, not trusting his voice. She poured 2 cups from a pot that sat warm on the stove. The liquid was black as midnight and strong enough to wake the dead. "You don't believe me." It wasn't a question. Cross wrapped his hands around the cup, feeling the heat seep through the ceramic into his palms. "Show me the papers." She disappeared, into what must have been Thomas's study. Cross heard the sound of a drawer opening, papers rustling. When she returned, she carried a leather folder that she placed on the table between them. The marriage certificate looked official. The ink was faded but clear. Thomas Cross and Evangeline Harper joined in matrimony 6 months before Thomas died. The preacher's signature was bold and confident. Cross stared at the document, trying to make sense of what he saw. His brother had written to him regularly, never once mentioned a woman, never hinted at romance or companionship. Why? The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. Evangeline sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap with the patience of someone accustomed to waiting. He was lonely. The simple answer carried the weight of truth. Cross had seen his brother's letters, read between the lines of cheerful updates about cattle and weather. Thomas had been dying of solitude long before the fever took him. "And you?" Her eyes met his then, direct and unflinching. "I needed protection." The admission cost her something. Cross could see it in the way her shoulders tightened, the slight tremor in her hands as she reached for her coffee cup. From what? But she was done talking. The conversation had reached its natural end, marked by the silence that settled between them like dust on everything else in this godforsaken territory. Cross pulled out Thomas's will, the document that had brought him here in the first place. He'd expected to inherit the ranch, the cattle, the small fortune his brother had accumulated through years of careful living. Instead, he found his name mentioned only once, as a witness to his brother's final wishes. Everything, down to the last penny and head of cattle, belonged to the woman sitting across from him. Evangeline watched him read, her face revealing nothing. When he finished, she spoke. "You can stay the night. Storm's coming." Cross looked toward the windows. The sky was clear, painted in the soft colors of approaching sunset. But as he watched, he saw the thin line of clouds gathering on the horizon. She was right. She knew this land better than he did. "I'll leave, tomorrow." The words tasted like ashes in his mouth. He had nowhere to go. The war had taken everything. His plantation was gone, burned to nothing by Sherman's march. His wife was dead, buried in a grave he'd never seen. His son was lost somewhere, in the chaos that followed surrender. He was broke, homeless, a man without purpose or place in a world that had moved on without him. "There's a room upstairs." Evangeline rose from the table, collecting the cups with the same quiet efficiency she seemed to bring to everything. "Supper's at 6. Cross climbed the stairs as darkness settled over the ranch like a shroud. The room she'd given him was sparse but clean. A bed, a washstand, a window that looked out over land that should have been his. He lay on the narrow mattress, listening to the sounds of the house settling around him. Somewhere below, Evangeline moved through her evening routine with the practiced rhythm of someone who'd done this countless times before. Thunder rumbled in the distance. The storm was coming, just as she'd predicted. Cross closed his eyes and tried not to think about tomorrow, when he'd have to leave this place and face the emptiness that waited beyond the horizon. In the kitchen below, Evangeline stood at the window, watching lightning flicker across the sky. She'd learned to read storms the way other people read books. This one would be fierce but brief. By morning, the air would be clean and the dust settled. She touched the marriage certificate that still lay on the table, her fingers tracing Thomas's careful signature. He'd saved her life with those letters, that ceremony performed by a preacher who asked no questions and recorded only what he was told. Now Thomas's brother was here, and everything she'd built was balanced on the edge of a knife. Outside, the wind began to howl. Cross stayed another day, then another. The excuse changed with the weather. Rain had turned the roads to mud. His horse had thrown a shoe. The fence line needed mending. Truth was simpler. He had nowhere else to go. Evangeline accepted his presence the way the earth accepted rain, without comment or complaint. She cooked for two now, set 2 places at the table, left space for his silence at the end of each day. They worked the ranch together with the careful choreography of strangers learning each other's rhythms. Cross mended what was broken. Evangeline tended what grew. Neither spoke of the arrangement that kept them bound together by necessity and Thomas's ghost. The 4th morning brought visitors. Cross was splitting wood behind the house when he heard the wagon wheels. He set down his axe and moved to the front porch, where Evangeline already stood watching a dust cloud approach from the east. The wagon held a dozen children ranging from 5 to maybe 12 years old. They sat quiet and still, eyes wide as they took in the ranch, the man standing on the porch, the woman who moved down the steps to greet them. An older woman drove the wagon, stern-faced and practical, with hands that spoke of hard work and harder choices. "Miss Sarah." Evangeline's voice carried warmth Cross hadn't heard before. The transformation was subtle but complete. Her shoulders relaxed, her step quickened. Evangeline. The older woman climbed down from the wagon seat with the careful movements of someone who carried pain in her bones. She embraced Evangeline briefly, a gesture that spoke of shared understanding. The children are hungry. It wasn't a request. Evangeline nodded and turned toward the house. They always are. Cross watched the children file down from the wagon. They moved with the cautious precision of small animals who'd learned that survival depended on stillness. No laughter, no chatter. Just the soft shuffle of feet against packed earth. One boy lingered at the wagon's edge. Smaller than the others, maybe 8 years old. His clothes were too big, hanging loose on a frame that spoke of recent illness or injury. He clutched a piece of paper in one hand, fingers white-knuckled with the effort of holding on. Samuel. The older woman's voice was gentle but firm. The boy looked up, eyes that held too much knowledge for someone so young. He slipped the paper into his pocket and followed the others toward the house. Cross felt something twist in his chest. The boy's careful movements, the way he held, his shoulders, the shape of his hands. He'd had a son once, before the war took everything. Inside, Evangeline had transformed the kitchen into a feast. Bread still warm from the oven, stew that filled the air with the scent of meat and vegetables, milk fresh from the morning milking. The children ate with the focused intensity of people who understood hunger. No words passed between them, but glances and gestures spoke volumes. They'd learned to communicate in the language of survival. Cross found himself studying the boy called Samuel. Something about him tugged at memory, like a half-remembered song or the ghost of a familiar scent. The boy drew while he ate, quick sketches on scraps of paper that he pulled from his pockets. Houses, trees, people with faces that carried sadness, like a weight. After the meal, the children scattered to explore the ranch under Miss Sarah's watchful eye. Samuel remained at the table, paper spread before him, pencil moving with the steady rhythm of someone lost in their own world. Cross approached slowly, the way he might approach a wounded animal. The boy looked up once, eyes meeting his for a heartbeat before returning to his drawing. The sketch was taking shape. A house with smoke rising from the chimney. Figures in the yard. A man and woman standing close together, their faces turned toward something beyond the paper's edge. "You draw well." The boy's hand stilled. He looked up again, studying Cross with the careful attention of someone trying to solve a puzzle. He didn't speak. Miss Sarah had mentioned that Samuel hadn't said a word since they'd found him. Whatever he'd seen, whatever he'd survived, had stolen his voice and left only silence behind. But his eyes spoke volumes. Pain, loss. The careful wariness of someone who'd learned that safety was temporary and trust was earned in drops, not floods. Cross felt the familiar ache in his chest. His own son would be about this age now. If he'd survived. If he was somewhere out there, lost in the chaos that had swallowed so many children when the world came apart. That evening, after the children had been loaded back into the wagon and driven away, Cross found Evangeline on the porch. She sat in Thomas's old chair, hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on the horizon where the sun was painting the sky in shades of fire. "They come every month." Her voice was soft, barely audible above the evening wind. "The school feeds them what it can, but it's never enough." Cross settled into the chair beside her. The wood was worn smooth by weather and use, shaped by Thomas's body over countless evenings just like this one. The boy, Samuel. Evangeline turned to look at him. Something flickered in her eyes. Recognition, maybe, or warning. He was found during the war, a refugee camp in Kansas, no family, no name anyone could trace. Cross felt his heart skip a beat. Kansas was where he'd searched, where he'd walked through camp after camp, showing a daguerreotype of his son to anyone who would look. How long ago? 2 years, maybe 3. The timeline fit. The age was right, but this quiet, broken boy bore little resemblance to the laughing child Cross remembered. War changed everything it touched. children most of all. He doesn't speak? No. Evangeline's voice carried the weight of understanding. She'd seen what trauma could do, how it could steal voices and leave only silence behind. But he draws. Cross nodded. He'd seen the sketches, the careful attention to detail, the way the boy captured emotion in a few simple lines. His own son had been an artist, always sketching, always creating. Cross had carved him toys from scraps of wood, a rocking horse that had been the boy's favorite, with a flowing mane and painted saddle. What does he draw? Evangeline was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. Memories, things he's trying to forget. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain from the mountains. Another storm was coming. Cross could feel it in the air, in the way the light shifted and the horizon darkened. The next time they come. He stopped, unsure how to finish the sentence, unsure what he was asking for. Evangeline understood anyway. She had a gift for reading the spaces between words, the things that couldn't be spoken aloud. He'll be here. It wasn't a promise, just a statement of fact. The children would return as they did every month. Samuel would be among them, and Cross would have another chance to look into those wounded eyes and search for traces of the boy he'd lost. Inside the house, the shadows were growing long. Soon it would be time for supper, for the quiet rituals that marked the end of another day. Cross and Evangeline would sit across from each other at Thomas's table, sharing food and silence in equal measure. But something had changed. The careful distance they'd maintained was shifting. Common purpose was drawing them together like gravity, slow and inevitable. Neither spoke of it, but both felt the pull. Cross followed her to town on the third Tuesday. He told himself it was coincidence, business at the general store, supplies needed for the ranch, truth cut deeper than his lies. Evangeline drove the wagon with the steady hands of someone who'd made this journey countless times. She knew every rut in the road, every bend that hid the town from view until the last moment. Cross kept his distance, watched from the shadows, as she pulled up behind a weathered building that had once been a church. The sign above the door read, Freedmen's Aid Society, in paint that had seen better days. Children emerged from the building like water from a broken dam. Not just the dozen he'd seen at the ranch, but dozens more. All ages, all colors, all carrying the careful stillness of people who'd learned that survival meant invisibility. Evangeline moved among them with the grace of someone who understood their language. A touch here, a word there, small gestures that carried the weight of salvation. Cross watched a girl, maybe 10 years old, press a folded paper into Evangeline's hands. The woman read it quickly, her face revealing nothing. Then she nodded and tucked the paper into her coat. Another transaction, quiet, purposeful, the kind of exchange that happened in shadows and silence. Cross understood then. This wasn't charity. This was resistance. The Underground Railroad hadn't died with the war's end. It had evolved, adapted, found new purposes in a world that promised freedom, but delivered chains of a different kind. Evangeline wasn't just feeding hungry children. She was reuniting families, finding homes for the lost, moving people from danger to safety with the same careful precision that had once spirited slaves to freedom. The realization hit Cross like a physical blow. His brother's widow wasn't a fortune hunter or a lonely woman seeking security. She was a conductor on a railroad that still ran through the darkness, carrying human cargo toward hope. And she was, risking her life every day to do it. Cross retreated to the general store, his mind reeling. He bought supplies he didn't need and forgot half of what he'd come for. The clerk, a nervous man with thinning hair, kept glancing toward the window. That's dangerous business she's in. Cross looked up from the counter. The clerk was watching. Evangeline through the dusty glass, his expression a mixture of admiration and fear. Some folks don't appreciate her kind of help. The words carried weight. Warning. The kind of information passed between men who understood that some truths were too dangerous to speak aloud. Cross paid for his purchases and left without another word. But the clerk's warning echoed in his mind as he rode back to the ranch. That evening, Evangeline returned as the sun was setting. She moved through her usual routines with the same quiet efficiency, but Cross noticed the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes kept drifting to the windows. "You were in town today?" It wasn't a question. She'd seen him despite his efforts at concealment. Cross nodded. No point in denying the obvious. "I saw what you do." Evangeline set down the plate she'd been drying. Her hands were steady, but Cross caught the slight tremor in her fingers. "And what is it you think you saw?" "Hope." The word hung between them like smoke from a dying fire. Evangeline turned to face him, her eyes searching his face for signs of judgment or condemnation. She found neither. "Your brother knew." Her voice was barely above a whisper, a confession that cost her everything. Thomas helped when he could, gave money, provided safe passage when people needed to move through the territory. Cross felt another piece of the puzzle click into place. His brother's letters had mentioned visitors, travelers passing through. Cross had assumed they were cattle buyers or neighbors seeking Thomas's advice. Instead, they'd been refugees, people fleeing violence and persecution, seeking sanctuary in a land that promised freedom but rarely delivered it. The marriage. Cross understood now. The certificate that had seemed so mysterious suddenly made perfect sense. "It protected you." Evangeline nodded. A married woman had rights that a single woman, especially one doing the kind of work Evangeline did, could never claim. Thomas offered. I accepted. Simple words that carried the weight of salvation. Cross's brother had given Evangeline his name, his protection, his life's work. In return, she'd given him purpose and companionship in the last months of his life. It was a fair trade, an honorable one. "The children who come here." Cross was still processing the implications. The monthly visits suddenly took on new meaning. "Some are looking for family. Others need new families to find them." Evangeline's voice was steady now. The confession was complete. Whatever Cross chose to do with the information was beyond her control. "Samuel." The boy's name fell from Cross's lips like a prayer. Evangeline's eyes sharpened. "What about him?" Cross pulled the daguerreotype from his pocket. The image he'd carried through 2 years of searching. A family portrait taken before the war destroyed everything. Himself, his wife, and a laughing boy with eyes that held no shadow of pain. Evangeline studied the photograph in silence. When she looked up, her face was pale. "When was this taken?" 1863, before Sherman came through Georgia. The timeline aligned with everything Cross had learned. The refugee camps in Kansas. The boy found with no name and no memory of his past. "You think Samuel is your son?" Cross nodded, unable to trust his voice. The possibility was too fragile, too precious to speak aloud. Evangeline was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her words cut through Cross's hope like a blade through silk. He doesn't remember anything from before. The trauma took it all. Cross felt his heart crack. To find his son only to discover that the boy he'd been no longer existed was a cruelty he hadn't imagined possible. "He calls me Mama." The words were spoken gently, but they landed like blows. Samuel had found a new family, new loyalties, new love. Cross was a stranger to his own child. The next time he comes. Cross stopped, unsure what he was asking, what he hoped to accomplish. Evangeline understood anyway, she always did. "You can talk to him, but carefully. He's been hurt enough." Cross nodded. He would be careful, patient. He would approach his own son like a wild animal that might bolt at the first wrong move. Outside, the wind was picking up, another storm gathering on the horizon. Cross could feel it in his bones, the pressure that came before the breaking. Inside the house, 2 people sat in silence, bound together by secrets and shared purpose. The careful distance they'd maintained was crumbling. Common cause was drawing them together like gravity. Neither spoke of the danger that surrounded them. the men who watched from shadows, the threats that grew stronger with each passing day. But both felt the storm coming. The children returned on a Tuesday that dawned gray and heavy with unshed rain. Cross waited on the porch, hands steady. Despite the storm brewing in his chest, Samuel climbed down from the wagon last, clutching his familiar sheaf of papers. He moved with the careful precision of someone who'd learned that sudden movements brought pain. Cross approached slowly. The boy looked up once, eyes meeting his, with the wary attention of a deer testing the wind for danger. "What are you drawing today?" Samuel studied Cross for a long moment. Then he pulled a fresh piece of paper from his pocket and began to sketch. Quick, sure strokes that captured the ranch house, the barn, the figure of a man standing in shadow. But there was something else taking shape in the corner of the drawing, something that made Cross's breath catch in his throat. A rocking horse, small and simple but unmistakable. The flowing mane he'd carved with his own hands. The painted saddle that had been his son's favorite toy. Cross felt the world tilt beneath his feet. Samuel was drawing from memory, deep memory that trauma couldn't quite erase. "Where did you see that?" The boy's pencil stilled. He looked at the drawing as if seeing it for the first time. Confusion flickered across his features, followed by something that might have been fear. Samuel crumpled the paper and shoved it into his pocket. He ran toward the house, leaving Cross standing alone in the yard with the taste of recognition burning in his throat. Inside, Evangeline was setting the table with her usual quiet efficiency. She glanced up as Samuel burst through the door, noting the boy's agitated state with the practiced eye of someone who understood trauma's rhythms. Cross followed more slowly, his mind reeling with the implications of what he'd seen. The rocking horse was proof. Samuel was his son, the child he'd searched for through 2 years of heartbreak and empty hopes. But the boy who'd drawn it was a stranger, wounded, silent, shaped by experiences that had nothing to do with the laughing child Cross remembered. That evening, after the children had been loaded back into the wagon, Cross found Evangeline in Thomas's study. She sat at the desk, reading a letter by lamplight. Her face was pale, her hands trembling slightly as she held the paper. "What is it?" She looked up and Cross saw fear in her eyes. Real fear, the kind that came from knowing that safety was an illusion and danger was always one step behind. "They know." The words carried the weight of inevitable disaster. Cross didn't need to ask who they were. He'd seen the men watching from the shadows, felt their eyes on him in town. "How long do we have?" Evangeline folded the letter carefully, her movements precise despite the tremor in her fingers. "Days. Maybe less." Cross felt something settle in his chest, a decision made without conscious thought. He'd run from enough fights, lost enough ground to men who took what they wanted and left nothing but ashes behind. We could leave. The offer hung between them like smoke from a dying fire. Evangeline shook her head. "I won't run anymore." Her voice carried the quiet strength of someone who'd found the line they wouldn't cross. This ranch was home. The work she did here mattered. Some things were worth fighting for. Cross nodded. He understood the feeling. Some battles chose you whether you wanted them or not. Samuel. The boy's name fell from his lips like a prayer. If what was coming was as bad as Evangeline's fear suggested, the child would be caught in the crossfire. He'll be safe at the school. But they both knew that safety was relative. The men who hunted Evangeline wouldn't distinguish between one child and another. They saw only obstacles to be removed. Unless... Cross stopped, the thought half-formed and dangerous. Evangeline waited, understanding that some ideas needed time to breathe before they could be spoken. He could stay here. With us. The words carried implications that went far beyond mere protection. Cross was claiming the boy, not as his lost son, but as his chosen child, the family he'd found rather than the one he'd lost. Evangeline was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. He'd be in more danger here. Maybe. but he'd be with people who'd die before letting him be hurt. The truth of it settled between them like dust after a storm. This broken family they'd built from necessity and grief was worth protecting, worth fighting for, worth dying for if it came to that. The attack came at dawn 3 days later. Cross was feeding the horses when he heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching fast. Multiple riders moving with the purposeful rhythm of men on a mission. He grabbed his rifle and moved toward the house, where Evangeline was already at the window with her own weapon. Samuel sat at the kitchen table, drawing with the focused intensity that had become his refuge from a world that offered little peace. The riders stopped in the yard. 3 men, hard-faced and confident. The kind of confidence that came from knowing the law was on their side, or at least wouldn't interfere with their business. "We've come for the woman." The leader's voice carried across the yard like a death sentence. Cross stepped onto the porch, rifle cradled in his arms with the casual ease of someone who knew how to use it. "You're on private property. We have papers." The man pulled a folded document from his coat. Warrants, probably, or bounty notices, the kind of official sanction that turned murder into civic duty. Cross felt the familiar calm that came before violence. Time slowed. The world narrowed to essential elements: distance, wind speed, the weight of the rifle in his hands. Behind him, he heard Evangeline move to the window. Her position covered the side of the house, creating crossfire that would make the men think twice about their approach. Last chance. The leader's hand moved toward his gun, a casual gesture that spoke of countless similar confrontations. Most ended with surrender, sometimes with blood. This one would be different. Cross raised his rifle in one smooth motion. The first shot took the leader from his saddle before the man could clear leather. The second caught the rider on the left as he tried to bring his own weapon to bear. The third man wheeled his horse and spurred toward the barn, seeking cover. Evangeline's rifle cracked from the window. The rider tumbled to the ground and lay still. Silence settled over the ranch like dust after a windstorm. Cross lowered his rifle, ears ringing from the gunshots. The familiar aftermath of violence washed over him, relief mixed with regret, the knowledge that some problems could only be solved with blood. Behind him, the kitchen door opened. Samuel stepped onto the porch, his eyes wide but unafraid. He'd seen worse things than dead men in a yard. "Mama, who is that man?" The boy's voice was soft but clear, the first words he'd spoken since they'd found him. Cross felt his heart clench with a mixture of joy and sorrow. Samuel was speaking, but he was speaking to Evangeline. 6 months later, the 3 of them had settled into the rhythm of family. Cross and Evangeline had made their marriage real, sealed with promises that went deeper than convenience or protection. Samuel called Cross Papa now, but his memories of their life before remained locked away. The trauma had erased the past, so completely that the rocking horse existed only in drawings, disconnected from the man who'd carved it with love and hope. Cross found the old sketches one evening while cleaning Samuel's room. Drawings the boy had made in the early days when memory still flickered like candlelight in a storm. One showed their original family: Cross, his first wife, little Samuel, all of them smiling, in a world that no longer existed. Cross studied the drawing for a long moment. Then he carried it to the kitchen, where the fire burned low in the stove. Evangeline found him there watching the paper curl and blacken in the flames. What was that? Cross closed the stove door, sealing the ashes inside. Just some old memories that don't belong to anyone anymore. And that is all to the story, for now. Please let me know where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will create a story there. Consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. And if you enjoy our content, click this video on your screen. I promise you it's worth watching. See you tomorrow.